As the years roll along, new and exotic phobias are being created at an ever-accelerating rate. Phobia, or the irrational fear of something, is now the catch-all suffix to explain all manner of aversion. Traditional and well-known phobias such as agoraphobia, arachnophobia, aerophobia, autophobia, claustrophobia, hydrophobia have now been joined by newly defined irrational fears such as transphobia and Islamophobia. Now, while we are told things such as fear of open spaces, spiders, and flying, among many others, are irrational and abnormal fears, recent research is now suggesting that while most human learning is passed on generationally through teaching, recent studies in nature suggest that we may be genetically inheriting memories from our ancestors. And if that's true, it would explain a great many things, including why our society basically censors and punishes anyone for expressing the very innate human ability to notice. What's that? Notice what? Oh yeah, notice patterns. Some people are afraid of closed spaces while others of open spaces, claustrophobes and agoraphobes, if you will. Now, according to the DSM, specific phobias typically fall within 5 general categories. 1. Fears related to animals, spiders, dogs, insects, for example. 2. Fears related to the natural environment, heights, thunder, darkness. 3. Fears related to blood, injury, or medical issues, injections, broken bones, this sort of thing. 4. Fears related to specific situations, for example, flying, riding in an elevator, driving. And 5. Other things, such as choking, or loud noises, or a person drowning. Phobias are called irrational fears and, until very recently, were thought to be the mental baggage of the individual. But recent studies are beginning to suggest that, in fact, memories could possibly be passed down through the generations via DNA, in a process that may be the underlying cause of these phobias. For example, I grew up in basically a temperate rainforest climate, with most of the subspecies of local snakes in the region being quite harmless. The most common I ever came into contact with was your average garter snake. While as a child I knew they were harmless, and I also enjoyed playing with them upon finding them under a rock or tree, but always got a fleeting fright at first sight of slither. No matter how many times I handled them, no matter how much I knew that they were harmless, there was always the same initial reaction of being startled. And now we might be able to answer as to why people have innate phobias, and it really is quite fascinating. Researchers at the Emory University of Medicine in Atlanta are postulating that memories can be passed down through what can be described as genetic switches that allow for the transmission of experience through the generations. In that, in a very literal way, we may genetically inherit memories from our ancestors, kind of like a less focused version of the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers in the science fiction novel Dune by Frank Herbert, for those of you out there that are somewhat sci-fi geeks. Now, this is in direct opposition to the long-held consensus in science that all human knowledge must have been transmitted through the teaching of successive generations of accumulated personal experiences. The researchers hypothesize that traumatic or stressful events can cause chemical changes within the DNA of humans, and these changes can be passed down to our offspring, affecting their brains, and this is something the scientists call ancestral experience. In the study that was published in Nature Neuroscience, mice, before being allowed to breed, were trained to fear the smell of cherry blossoms using electric shocks. The offspring of these mice then exhibited the same fearful responses to the odor of cherry blossoms as compared to a neutral scent, despite never having encountered it before. The successive generation also exhibited the same behavior, and extraordinarily, this effect continued even if the mice had been fathered through artificial insemination. When studied, the researchers discovered the brains of the trained mice and their offspring showed structural changes in areas used to detect odor. The DNA of the animals also carried chemical changes on the gene responsible for detecting odors, and this suggests that somehow experiences can be transmitted from the brain into the genome and thus allowing them to be passed on to later generations. While there have been no clinical experimentation on humans, obviously, Professor Marcus Pembry, who is a pediatric geneticist at the University College of London, said the work provided compelling evidence for the biological transmission of memory. Thus, this area of inquiry could explain why most people are not particularly fond of the creepy crawly, for example, even if they pose no harm, like me when initially coming across garter snakes, for example, because phobias, or what we call irrational fears, could be, as the researchers call them, built-in defense mechanisms, or memories that were burned into the DNA of our ancestors, meaning you and I have the memories of not only ourselves, but of those that have preceded us. In the early 21st century, the most discussed phobias or irrational fears are, and I think you know, homophobia, transphobia, and of course, Islamophobia. And given not only the 5 general categories that phobias fall into, but also the developing concept of the biological transmission of memories, it would seem that these phenomena, homophobia, transphobia, and Islamophobia, were mislabeled from the outset, and that this should be understood in a political context. So let's break this down a little bit more. Homophobia and transphobia, first and foremost, are sociological expressions of culture, while Islamophobia is an expression of observational or social anxiety of Islam and or Muslims. And none of these 3 phenomena can be described as psychological or individualistic phobias. While up to very recently in the West and presently in other cultures that adhere to an Abrahamic tradition, homosexuality had been viewed very negatively. However, homosexuality and the acceptance of it have varied widely across time and across cultures. This is also the same situation for the transgender, where cultures as diverse as the Lakota and Blackfoot tribes of North America had the concept of what can be translated loosely as a two-spirited person. While over in Italy, the femminilio, roughly translated to little man woman, refers to biological males who dress up as women and assume female gender roles in Neapolitan society. Their station in society is, or rather was, up through the 19th century privileged, and the rituals, including marriage to one another, were based on Greek mythology related to Hermaphroditus and Tiresias, who was transformed into a woman for 7 years. So both of these phobias are more related to the cultural views of these practices at any given time and in any given place, rather than on any innate phobia that people can have at a fundamental level. Whereas Islamophobia, on the other hand, is chiefly presented as a political vehicle. It's said to have been coined toward the end of the 1970s by radical Iranian fundamentalists. There are other origin stories to the word, but what they all have in common is that Islamophobia was wed with the term xenophobia, with the aim of declaring the religion of Islam inviolate, specifically targeting the Western world. When used today, the term is deliberately unspecific about whether it refers to a religion, a belief system, or its faithful adherents. The only specific thing about the term is that it's tied to racism, and more specifically, Western people's racism. And this is, as everyone knows, the cardinal and unforgivable sin in contemporary secular Western society. Think about that, and think about this. There is no Hindu, Theravada, Zen, Methodist, Coptic, Zoroastrian, Judaic, Sikh, Shinto, or other religion that has the term phobia attached to it. There's no other religion that is wed to an irrational phobia that is then wrapped in the blanket of racism, and rightly so. Just like Marxists and libertarians, Christians, Buddhists, and yes, Muslims come from all over the globe and come in all colors. In a democratic society, nobody is obliged to give deference to any religion or any ideology and has every right to reject anything that aggressively proselytizes with the claim of absolute truth, and this has nothing to do with racism. What it has to do with, and why the term was created and what it's trying to shut down in the current year, has more to do with noticing patterns. Patterns that our current secular ideology in the West has declared verboten from recognizing. Because having a phobia 20 years ago exclusively meant having a benign mental hiccup, such as agoraphobia or arachnophobia or the like. But in recent years, the addition of the suffix phobia to something else is now drenched with political nuance, cultural epistemology, and social stigma. And the same can also be said in the last few years with the word denier, as in climate change denier. To deny is to state that one refuses to admit the truth or the existence of something. While the majority of scientific consensus is that climate change is real, consensus is far from truth. I am of no doubt that humans are having an horrific impact on the natural world, and I am of no doubt that we are poisoning the oceans and destroying countless species of terrestrial life. But skepticism of something is not denial, and to use the word denier when talking about climate change is not to state an opinion or to delineate the different sides of an argument, but is used like X, Y, and Z plus phobia to shut down the discussion entirely. The word phobia, as it's being used in the current parlance, as well as denier when it comes to things like climate change, is a political cudgel used by ideological zealots to bludgeon others into silence. It's about time people begin to recognize that this suffix and noun are going to be attaching themselves to a whole array of other political positions in the very near future. But more importantly, why these words in particular are being used, and if a phobia is a genetically inherited memory used as a defense mechanism, as research is beginning to suggest, then the word phobia really isn't the right word to be used when discussing sociological interaction between people, groups, and ideas. But as always, they don't care. It's all about the framing. Thanks very much for watching. If you like this kind of material, please consider subscribing. Also hit the alert bell to be notified when new uploads are made. Whether that works or not is anyone's guess. Also, like and share this video if you think your friends might enjoy this kind of content. And as always, I'll see you next time.